From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. The economics editor of The Times, Mehreen, is always the first to spot a trend. True to form, a few months ago, she saw it coming.
Mamdani sort of came on my radar on social media, I would say around April time.
She noticed a new voice popping up on economics podcasts.
Zohran Mamdani, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great.
Zohran, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Zohran Mamdani, the man who is meeting the moment, who has captured the zeitgeist.
And I noticed that he was somebody I've never heard of. He was pretty young, but he had a sort of virality about him. And that's because he's really great at talking. I think he has a natural sort of charisma. And the thing that really made me take notice was that he called himself a democratic socialist.
That's a scary word.
Socialism?
Yeah. So you're a socialist? What does that mean?
Democratic socialist, baby.
And then weeks and weeks go by and I just see him getting more momentum, right? I see more of sort of my normie friends in WhatsApp groups showing me clips of Zohran Mamdani.
Normie friends.
Yeah, even the aunties, like even my Asian aunties and uncles, like the group chats are on fire with Zohran
Really?
Mamdani speaking in Hindi, doing Hindi campaign videos.
New Yorkers मुश्किल से afford कर रहे हैं रोटी, कपड़ा और मकान. मैं ये
Rapping when he was a bit younger.
Go ahead, make a rap for your natty. It's a rap. Get the guap, spend a rack on your natty.
Talking about halal food carts.
Would you rather pay $10 for a plate of halal or $8? $8.
You know, I'm South Asian, I'm also Muslim. So there was this part of his identity which just appealed to my family members, my friends who are predominantly British and don't live in New York City.
This socialist, former rapper, wasn't just whipping up a social media storm. He was running a political campaign to be the Democratic candidate for the mayor of New York.
Ordinarily, I don't pay that much attention to city elections across the world, but this is going to be one of the first biggest electoral tests of the Democrats in the Trump age, and we're all kind of sharing this guy's sort of viral clips. And this is when I thought, okay, maybe there's something more to this than just, you know, a democratic socialist trying to reinvent the left wing of the Democratic Party. Maybe this guy's got legs.
And, as ever, Mehreen was right. Last week, a political star was born.
My friends, we have done it.
33-year-old Zohran Mamdani won a stunning electoral victory, beating a host of veteran politicians.
I will be your Democratic nominee for the mayor of New York City.
The aftershocks of last night's political earthquake in New York City are still reverberating throughout New York.
In a stunning upset, 33-year-old state assemblyman Zohran Mamdani has declared victory over former governor
Whoa, yeah. Okay, tell us where we are.
So who is Zohran Mamdani? Just how did this relative unknown become the Democratic candidate for one of the most important political roles in America? And what does his rise tell us about the increasing popularity of left-wing economics?
Many analysts see New York City's mayoral race as a litmus test between establishment Democrats and the younger, more progressive wing of the party.
Mamdani's success last night tapped into the seismic dissatisfaction we see in poll after poll among the party base with the political establishment and status quo.
The story today: what Zohran Mamdani's win means for the future of the Democrats. Mehreen, you are a regular on the podcast, but not normally on subjects like this. So would you mind just starting by reintroducing yourself to our listeners?
Sure. Well, everything can be economics. My name is Mehreen. I'm the economics editor at The Times.
Mehreen, take us back to last week when there was a political earthquake in America. Just describe what happened.
Yeah, I think probably a political earthquake centered very much on New York City. And that's because Zohran Mamdani, a 33-year-old democratic socialist, self-identified, beat Andrew Cuomo, who comes from one of the dynasties of New York politics. He beat Andrew Cuomo in a primary election and against all odds came from basically nowhere to become what people are hailing as the fresh new face of the Democratic Party. And by winning that primary, he set himself up as the Democrats' candidate for the New York City mayoral election, which is happening this November. Very much pole position to become the first South Asian, first Muslim, and I think the youngest mayor in New York City's history for at least 100 years. So there's a lot of precedents that are going to be broken if indeed he does get the job.
And the final results on that are actually expected any moment now. But as far as we can tell, he does seem to have won. Just explain why that was such a shock.
Well, I guess like a lot of listeners and most people who opened up their newspapers on Wednesday or Thursday last week, Zohran Mamdani is not a face or a name that they knew. He's not a member of the Democratic Party's sort of establishment. Of course, it's a New York City race, so there's no need for people outside New York City to know who mayoral candidates are. But New York City is such an important city for Democrats, and obviously it's the beating heart of Wall Street. It is the home of corporate America to some degree. New York City mayors are actually international politicians. So the fact that this guy is going to be in the running for the party, the Democrats that often win this race, means that he's effectively on a one-way course to becoming one of the most important Democratic Party politicians. Even more importantly, in the first sort of major election since the presidential election in 2024. So, it's a big political moment because of where America is right now under the Trump administration. And as probably we're going to chat about, it might tell us a little bit about where the Democratic Party's future is going to lie electorally in the age of Trump.
I mean, it was a particularly unlikely victory because, you mentioned that New York is obviously the home of corporate America. There was a lot of money behind the other candidates.
There was. I mentioned Andrew Cuomo before, and he was the recognizable name. People in New York know the Cuomos through his father. He had a lot of name recognition. Cuomo has a sort of incumbency advantage. He's not the sitting mayor, but he has the kind of all the name recognition that when people vote in New York City, they're going to vote for the guy whose name they recognize, Andrew Cuomo, despite, lots of sort of stories and allegations around his misconduct in office before.
His opponents brought up his dozen-plus sexual harassment allegations, for which he says he's both apologized and has denied.
The people who don't feel safe are young women, mothers, and grandmothers around Andrew Cuomo. That's the greatest threat to public safety.
So the fact that Mamdani's come from, effectively, it feels like nowhere, to de-seat Cuomo, who actually had to sort of step down. He said that he wasn't going to run when it looked like the polling showed that Mamdani was going to win.
He really ran a highly impactful campaign. I called him, I congratulated him, I applaud him sincerely for his...
It seems that first-time voters, a lot of early voting has really pushed him over the line. And yeah, now we're all talking about him, which I guess is why I'm here.
It is a remarkable campaign, and we want to hear more about him, and thank God you're an aficionado, so we'll talk about him in a moment.
I think I'm a stalker at this point, but sometimes it comes in handy.
Well, Mehreen, I wasn't going to say it, but thank God we've got one on staff. But just before we do, just tell us a bit about, what are his big policies? You mentioned that he's a democratic socialist. That's quite unusual in the Democratic Party these days. What are some of the policies he wants to introduce? What's his manifesto for New York?
Every politician says New York is the greatest
city on the globe.
But what good is that if no one can afford to live here?
Yeah, I think that one of the other reasons that I really became a little bit invested in this campaign was because how much of it is actually dominated by economic policy. And I don't think that's been a norm for lots of Democrats, and I don't think that's been a norm in US politics, which of course everyone has seen has become dominated by issues of identity and culture. So the Mamdani campaign was entirely focused on a couple of big themes. I think the biggest is affordability for working class New Yorkers, and then offshoots of that are things like housing, transport, childcare provision. And that's why I think it's interesting to understand this as a potential blueprint for what Democrats could do in the future, because one of the biggest, I think, failings potentially of the Biden administration and then the Kamala campaign was this accusation that they were not focused enough on cost of living, on the material pressures facing American voters, and strayed too much into the sort of signaling about saving democracy or, being good, progressive, liberal people. Sometimes it's called wokeism. And that's sort of one of the things that people think that Biden failed at. And so now you have this new generation doing a super cost of living focused campaign. And, the economics correspondent in me is sort of interested in to see what this guy's coming up with and whether it's going to stick with voters. And initially, the answer seems to be yes.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be very popular with voters. The ideas like rent freezes in New York, where property prices and rents are out of control, are obviously hugely popular. They're not necessarily popular within the Democratic Party, though. I mean, as an economist, what's the consensus on policies like that?
Sure, let's go through some of them.
I'm freezing. Your rent as the next mayor of New York City. Let's plunge into the details.
So you mentioned rent freezes in existing rent control buildings, of which New York City has. It has housing or apartments which are already under some form of rent control, and Mamdani wants to have an actual freeze, so they don't even rise in line or below inflation. They stay where they are. The other one is building of homes. So he's got a target of 200,000 new home builds, also under rent controls over the next 10 years. It's a pretty modest target, but again, very much clear focus on affordable housing. He has slightly, I think, kookier ideas, like maybe the state should own grocery shops, so a few state-run grocery shops where people can buy their food at wholesale prices. This is not necessarily to, take over American grocery chains, but a few of these bodega-type grocery shops that Americans use all the time. I mentioned things like the halal cart, which is a very specific New York City thing, which is a food truck where you can buy basically rice and chicken or rice and meat. He had this fantastic couple of videos of him talking to halal food cart owners, asking them why they've had to raise their prices. And this is basically a question about where they're allowed to pitch their food trucks.
How much do you have to pay for your permit?
Before it was 22K.
17,000.
These are the 4 bills that are sitting in the city council right now, which would give these vendors their own permits and make your halal more affordable.
Free childcare, free buses, raising corporation tax, taxing billionaires. This is all, in some sense, not really very revolutionary, but because we haven't heard Democratic Party politicians really hone in on issues of cost of living for, I think, probably since Bernie Sanders, it did feel pretty refreshing. And of course, it's centered around the inhabitants of New York City, which he's won. So I think it had an immediate direct resonance with the kind of people he wanted to come out to vote, in contrast with Andrew Cuomo, who I think was this sort of pretty distant, patrician sort of figure that perhaps was just sort of relying on his name recognition and his previous accolades to sort of get him through the campaign. So when you watch them in debates, there was just a clear identity and a strategy that Mamdani had.
The difference between myself and Andrew Cuomo is that my campaign is not funded by the very billionaires who put Donald Trump in D.C. I don't have to pick up the phone from Bill Ackman or Ken Langone.
Okay, Mr. Mamdani, thank you. Mr. Cuomo, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, please. Mr. Mamdani is very good on Twitter and with videos, but he actually produces nothing for him to accuse me of lying. Donald Trump would go through Mr. Mamdani like a hot knife through butter. He's been in government 27 minutes. He passed 3 bills. That's all he's done. He has no experience with Washington.
Look, it's true that I don't have experience with corrupt Trump billionaires who are funding my campaign. I don't have experience with party politics and insider consultants.
And, the policies that you've named, things like free childcare, free buses, would be popular in any big city, I suspect. How does he plan to fund those? That's always the question. Is it just by taxing the wealthy?
Pretty much. He wants to raise New York City's income tax to match that of New Jersey, to raise extra few billions of pounds. I think his free bus plan, he's costed at something like $700 million, which he says something can be raised through increasing income tax. He wants to increase income tax on people who earn more than $1 million a year. And in that sense, this is pretty standard leftist economics. I think it's an incredibly simple in many ways message, and it stood out so much because so few, I think, of politicians in the Democratic Party are willing to just really commit to what he calls democratic socialism. I would say is sort of a tax and welfare policy that is centered around public utilities, the supply of housing, the supply of transport, the welfare state, things which perhaps some of us in Europe take for granted, but in America are truly quite revolutionary ideas.
And as you said, a lot of first-time voters were coming out. Is this a generational thing?
Potentially, but not exclusively. I think his appeal is very much about working class, middle class New Yorkers. And from the data that we've seen, he does seem to have a reasonable spread across geographic and ethnic lines in New York around people in that sort of socioeconomic bracket. And when you have a message that is focused really on the material stuff and less on the identity stuff, I think he proves that that's probably a pretty healthy way for the Democrats to go, especially if you believe the critique that the Democrats have really lost sight of the sort of material conditions of people.
Mehreen, let's not pretend your interest is solely economic. As a stalker of this man, tell us a bit about him. What do we know about the character?
Yeah, I think he's a pretty interesting fellow for many reasons. We should talk about his name. His name is Zohran Mamdani. And you would probably think, Kwame, why? Because his parents named him after Kwame Nkrumah, who was a sort of Ghanaian political revolutionary who helped Ghana's independence from British colonialism. And it also reflects the fact that he was born in Uganda. He is a East African Indian. His parents are from Gujarat. He was born in Uganda and then moved to Manhattan when he was a kid. So he was raised in New York City. His parents themselves are pretty interesting. I was thinking about how to present his parents on the podcast, and then I sort of thought, his parents have weirdly raised me in a way. And I didn't really know this until I looked into this guy.
This is so interesting.
Yeah, his father
Just explain that.
Sure, I mean, not in a literal sense.
I was going to say.
I mean, his parents may have raised many of us, particularly people of my generation. So his father is Mahmoud Mamdani, who's a professor at Columbia University. He's sort of a professor of decolonization or post-colonial professor who wrote fantastic books. I remember reading one called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim about America in the post-9/11 era.
This is not about Islam. It is about America. So when I called my book Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, it was ironic.
And it's interesting because, you know, decolonization studies and Columbia University are two of the exact sort of things that this Trump administration has had in its crosshairs. So we already know this very sort of difficult relationship between Columbia and the federal government over student activism around Gaza. And the other one, of course, being sort of what the Trump administration thinks is sort of DEI studies. So all the things it hates, decolonization studies, critical race theory, the kind of woke academics, of which I think Mamdani is definitely one of them. So it really pushes the buttons of the current incumbent administration. I didn't know Mahmoud Mamdani was the father of Zohran until a couple of months ago, but those were the sort of books that I was reading at university and when I was a bit younger. And then his mom, on the complete flip side of the sort of serious academia side, is Mehreen, who is a pretty acclaimed film director who's done movies like Monsoon Wedding, sort of inescapable totemic Bollywood movie, Mississippi Masala with Denzel Washington. Most people have probably watched something that she's produced, directed, or been a part of. Yeah. So he's got this very acclaimed sort of jazzy celebrity parents.
You mentioned he was born in Uganda. At what point does he become an American citizen? Because, you know, the other thing Donald Trump has been famous for is sort of the birther movement, worrying about where political figures are actually born.
He gained his, I guess it's called naturalization in the US, I think in 2018. So pretty recently, he would have still been a very young man. It's a good question about whether his background is going to be weaponized against him. He is an American citizen. So for now, that question is not going to be something that I think is going to inhibit his political career. But it'll be interesting to see, you know, now that people are discovering this guy and his background a little bit more, how much of that is going to be used against him. We did actually see towards the end of this campaign that there was a lot more of this sort of vitriolic personal attacks against Mamdani. One of the biggest ones is the idea that he's anti-Semitic because he was asked about the phrase globalized intifada, which some people say is an anti-Semitic term. And Mamdani said he didn't think intifada was an anti-Semitic term. It's the Arabic word for sort of uprising. So there was a lot of money going in at the end of the campaign to really discredit him as a character. So you saw him on shows like Stephen Colbert really facing a lot of these attacks about whether he would help make New York City unsafer for the Jewish residents of New York City.
What do you say to those New Yorkers who are afraid that you wouldn't be their mayor, that you wouldn't protect them?
You know, I know where that fear is coming from. It's a fear that is based upon the horrific attacks we've seen in Washington, D.C., in Boulder, Colorado. It's something that we have to tackle. We have to make clear there's no room for it in this city, in this country, in this world.
And no justification for violence of any kind?
No, there is no room for violence in this city, in this country, in this world.
And how did he end up running for, you know, the Democrat candidate for the mayor of New York at such a young age? I mean, what has his journey been?
So he talked about his own political awakening, being in that sort of 2016 moment where Sanders and Trump are the sort of two outsiders trying to vie for the American presidential bid.
I am a democratic socialist, yes, and I started to call myself that after Bernie Sanders' 2016 run for president, when I finally had a language to describe the way that I saw the world and the way that I believe the world should be, which is one where every person has the dignity they need to live a decent life.
So yeah, he became, I guess, the equivalent of a local councillor in Queens. so a borough of New York City. He never really held any office beyond that, so very few New Yorkers will know about him. But he decided that he wanted to put his name in the ring, as anyone can do, as long as they want to self-identify as Democrats. And he made that decision basically around the presidential election last year in October and November, when, of course, most of us and most Americans were focused on the bigger political battle between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And the campaign, I think, really gets steam when he has one viral video in particular. He's got a microphone. He's walking around the streets of New York City asking people about their cost of living and what they're most worried about.
How do you feel about how much it costs to live in New York City right now?
I am currently in the process of trying to find my own place to live. How can I do that sustainably while also supporting myself, supporting my loved ones? We deserve so much better. Everything's so damn expensive. Even like middle class families are struggling just to get by.
And I guess when your mum's a Bollywood or a movie film producer, your campaign videos are pretty slick. And I have to say, they're some of the best I've ever seen. I mean,
Really?
they're really, really good. I would put his name into YouTube. You'll see the guy. He's got a mic. He's talking to ordinary people. There's a cringiness about him. He's a bit of a dork, but I think Americans have a higher tolerance for that sort of stuff than Brits do. And yeah, doing it in Spanish, doing his videos in Hindi, sitting in his local cafe, playing around with mango lassi, and, really embracing all the parts of his identity. Even his wedding photos on the New York subway went totally viral a couple of weeks ago.
And you said he seems a bit dorky, but he has garnered a lot of celebrity support.
So he got the endorsement of Bernie Sanders, his political hero, and AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's sort of Bernie's running mate.
Zohran has run an extraordinary campaign. He has taken on the entire establishment.
This is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and I am here loud and proud to rank Zohran Mamdani #1 for mayor of New York City.
So he got the endorsement of these two figures who've really been the bulwarks of anti-Trumpism in the Democratic Party. Some of Mamdani's celebrity backers include Bone Yang, who's a comedian on Saturday Night Live, so one of the most watched TV programs in the US.
We're so lucky to have Zohran as a candidate. Let's give him all the support he needs.
Another one is Emily Ratajkowski, who's a sort of music video model turned millennial influencer.
It is Emily Ratajkowski and
Zohran Mamdani.
It's election day today. You need to get to the polls. They're open till 9.
So yeah, he became, the trendy candidate. And a lot of people will probably think that's exactly a reason why he shouldn't be New York City mayor. But for now, it's really working in his favor. I mean, he's really having a moment. It's almost like everything he touches turns to gold.
Mehreen, you've been telling us about Zohran Mamdani, this man who describes himself as a democratic socialist, very much from the left of the party, particularly economically. Is what he's offering a form of economic populism?
For, I would say, a while now, economic populism has almost been a sort of preserve of people on the right. And the Trump administration is part of that. So the MAGA wing of the Trump administration are really sort of right-leaning economic populists. So they are providing solutions to people's day-to-day issues, including their cost of living, their housing, their bills, but they're doing it from the right. I think what the Mamdani campaign shows is that the left can also do economic populism. And if that is the case, then I think it's an example for so many of the parties on the left and the centre-left, including the one in government in the UK, about how to have an economic populist message that is directly appealing to voters and is also basically ensuring that the right don't just have a monopoly on this idea that they're the only people that are going to support the little man over the big corporations.
Well, in a way, Mehreen, this is exactly why we're doing this episode, because all stalking aside, he's a very charismatic, very interesting character rising up, being touted as the next Obama, as a big political star in America. What he represents is so much more than the battle in New York. It is the battle across America to work out how you come up with left-wing populism to fight Trump, but also, as you say, sort of, across the world. In Britain, we see it with Reform sort of actually putting out a lot of the policies that try to appeal to the working man in a way that the left has slightly forgotten. So just take us to that sort of argument within the Democratic Party right now. People are seeing what happens in New York as the first round of working out the future for the Democrats. Is this a viable option?
Exactly. I think before we can talk about left-wing populism being exported around the world, I think we have to talk about how the Democrats so let's call them the mainstream Democrats, deal with this sort of insurgent wing of the party that seems to be getting legs. And the parallel, of course, is Bernie Sanders in 2016. And you could argue that effectively it was the mainstream moneyed Hillary wing of the party that had to sort of destroy Bernie because he was just too much of a threat to the status quo. And now the challenge is how I think the center of the Democratic Party handle Mamdani. And it's not clear to me that they are going to be embracing him at this point.
I do think the Democratic Socialist program would be profoundly dangerous for New York, for the Democratic Party, and for the United States.
There's still an open question about what Andrew Cuomo and a lot of the money behind the Cuomo campaign does in November. And there's a very realistic prospect that he will run Cuomo in November as an independent, so not as a Democrat, against the Democratic candidate, Mamdani, and really create a referendum forcing Democrats to choose between what they want their future to be. I've already seen in sort of pockets of like the liberal Democratic establishment, this rallying cry that now it's time for the rest of the party to consolidate to defeat Mamdani. So sort of do a Sanders style, I don't want to call it a political execution, but basically to sort of neuter this wing of the party. And that's because the party just doesn't really know where its heart and soul is. And it probably has to go through this infighting process to work out where they come out in the end.
And Mehreen, as you say, we've kind of seen this playbook before. We saw it work very badly for Bernie Sanders. The Democrat Party, sort of made the threat of Sanders go away. Have things changed since then, though? Because we've seen a lot of young people coming out to vote for Mamdani. We've seen, in the meantime, sort of, TikTok full of left-wing economists suddenly becoming cool. Is something happening in the grassroots with sort of, again, it's a generational question, with sort of a younger generation who want a different Democrat Party?
Yes, and I think in some senses, the most interesting thing about this is not just that people who are fed up with capitalism are turning towards the left. People who are fed up with capitalism are also voting for Donald Trump. So much of the moral angst about the Trump victory was that he actually did energize a lot of young voters, a lot of young men who spend time on platforms like TikTok. And this was a huge, this has been a huge moral panic in the Democrats. Like, how do we win back these people? Like, why are these young men or younger people just not attracted to our message? And I think that's what's unique about the moment, as I mentioned, is that the anti-capitalists are now on the right and they're on the left. And the people in the middle are probably both mainstream Democrats and Republicans, or in this country, mainstream Labour politicians and mainstream Tories. And on the other end, you've got, so in the UK case, Reform. I think in the US case, so sort of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. And on the left, we don't really know who's going to be the sort of leading figures of the left part of the anti-capitalist agenda. And Mamdani's put his hand up clearly as to be one of them. I think in the UK, we don't really know where this wing of, if there is this appetite for left political and economic thought goes. It's a much more diffuse and I think ideologically flexible anti-capitalist agenda, which is why you can get people like Trump kind of doing a bit of anti-capitalism in the same way that Bernie Sanders is doing a bit of anti-capitalism. And I think that's what's special about the moment, and that's what's so uncertain about this moment. I think Zohran Mamdani is going to try and attract the kind of voters, effectively, who also voted for Donald Trump in the last election.
And we've focused on the economic arguments here, but one of the things that he represents that is a departure from normal Democrat policy is actually his worldview, the way he's willing to talk about foreign policy. Just give us a flavour of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Zohran Mamdani, when he was in university as an undergraduate, set up a sort of action group on Palestine. It's been a very big part of his younger political identity. He's been very clear in calling Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide. He's also been very clear on other foreign policy issues, which he gets asked about. Often, in the early part of his campaign, he'd get asked things like, if Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, came to New York, would you allow him to hold the rally? And Mamdani's been very clear. The answer is no, because he thinks that the Prime Minister of India was culpable in the mass slaughter of Muslims in Gujarat, so his family's home state. So he's taken a very clear line on strongmen, on conflicts around the world, in a way that where the rest of the Democratic Party has sort of prevaricated on these issues, he's very, very clear. And for now, it doesn't seem that these foreign policy issues have been a liability for him.
And just finally, I mean, is this how the Democrats fight Trump? Do you need left-wing populism to fight right-wing populism?
It depends who you ask. And I think the problem with the centre is that whatever their answer to Trumpism is, it just seems and sounds like all the other answers that they've used in the past and they've failed with. I think with the exception of the Biden administration, which is worth lingering on the economic policies of the Biden administration, which were really a pretty radical break from the past. So that past of sort of neoliberal market consensus that I spoke about. Because the Biden administration was like, okay, we're going to use a lot of federal money, so taxpayer money, to build factories, to hire American workers, to make incredible manufacturing stuff. And we want to be as good at this, if not better than China. It was a reindustrialization policy. And I think in some ways, the economic and political fealty that Democrats had to the consensus broke during the Biden administration. And there were lots of people inside the Democratic Party that didn't like Biden because they thought he was too radical. But I think that sort of Rubicon has been crossed. And I think there is now space in the Democratic Party to embrace truly radical ideas about economics, about cost of living issues, about the supply of public utilities like housing and transport, about when regulation is good and when regulation is bad. It's often called the abundance agenda. So the idea that the left should focus on abundance, having more of everything rather than redistributing the pie that you've got. And Mamdani has really captured that moment, that abundance moment, I think, right now. And I think he's creating a paradigm shift where Democrats of the future, the next generation of Democrats, younger people who want to vote Democrat, this is going to be the type of economic discourse that they embrace, rather than, I think, the more sort of Clinton, Obama model of we allow the markets to run their course and that's how Americans become prosperous and we want big companies and we want them to thrive. Now, actually, it's about putting the worker at the center of your economic policies. And that was a process that I think, to give him credit, did start under the Biden administration and is now going to get many faces and many legs, I think. And it's not just going to be Mamdani. We're probably going to see far more of these contests, intra-Democratic Party contests between the center of the party and the left of the party. And I imagine this is something that might also play out in a lot of developed world economies over the next 5 to 10 years.
That was Mehreen Khan, economics editor at The Times, and you can read more of her work, including her regular column, at thetimes.com. The producer today was Hannah Varrall, the executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.